Hello, this is Holly Odinsky, and this is actually my second time recording this. I ran out of time my first time, so I might talk a little fast, just to warn you. But this is my lesson, teaching using syntax, and I'm just going to go ahead and give a shout out to Dr. Versalati. She did help me come up with this idea, and then I developed it from there. But the background and setting of this lesson would be that it's for my world language survey class. Survey means that I only see them for a very short amount of time, and we do very basics of the language, and then in turn they're supposed to use that knowledge to decide which language they want to take at the high school level. So the phrases and sentences and things that we are going to use in my class and then for this example are very simple because of that. So it is middle school, grades 6 through 8. My class is technically 7th grade, but it could be used for all three. And this could be a small group or a whole group activity. So the objectives here are obviously the students are going to use syntax or use their knowledge of syntax to realize how English sentence structures and those of our 5 languages either differ or are similar. They're going to identify the syntactic categories of the words that we're learning in our languages and in turn help memorize those words. And then they're going to construct sentences or clauses in the target languages using their knowledge of the syntax that they found out. So the standards, my world language standards for this lesson would be standard 1, and actually standard 2 has to do with written expression, which is the same thing as well. So using greetings, farewells in limited social situations, share information about yourself and others in simple terms like name, age, origin, physical attributes, etc. So that's about how simple we are in this class. But then also standard 7 has to do with comparisons, investigating the nature of language. They will understand the nature of the language and culture through comparisons to their own language. And standard 1.7.2 is recognizing and using level appropriate language structure. So I thought that was actually a perfect standard for this lesson. The materials that you're going to need would be colored construction paper, scissors, and a whiteboard or a blackboard or however it is that you use to show information to students. So obviously it's different maybe for everybody, but I have a projector and a whiteboard, so that's what I would be using, but you could also just write your sentences or use a blackboard or whatever. But there is a little bit of prep before this lesson. You would have to come up with your example sentences and slides ahead of time. So the ones that you're trying to get them to understand, you would want to come up with, and so that you can just project them at the time of the lesson. But each student is going to need their colored construction paper and their scissors because they're going to need a different colored shape for each syntactic category. So the examples I came up with were pronoun, nouns and / proper nouns, verbs, articles, adjectives, and question words. So I did modify a little bit these 2 syntactic categories just because of the level appropriateness of being 7th graders. I decided to omit determiner and just use article. And I also decided to use question word. And I know that that's not necessarily a real syntactic category. It'd probably be something more like adverbial, preposition, or pronoun. But again, I think that's too higher level for middle school. So I went with question word instead. So they would cut out their shapes and they could either label or not label them. It doesn't really matter. But you would want to make sure that the whole class has the same shapes for the same syntactic category. It would start to get a little difficult if everybody just chose their own. So once they have their shapes cut out and they are aware of which shape means what category, and again, you could write that on the board or they could write it on their own shapes or whatever. Then you would start by projecting English sentences on the board, or writing them, of course. So you'd want to give them some example sentences in English. Maybe these are sentences that you're going to end up doing in your language. So I used down here at the bottom of my slide, what is your name? And I am a student. So they would start to categorize each word and decide what shape then to put in what order. So for example, what is their question word? They would use their yellow trapezoid. Is the verb, so they would use their green square. Again, I omitted determiner here for your, because I think that getting into Genitive determiners is probably a bit too higher level for them, but maybe just your name as the noun. So then maybe they do I am a student after that, and they know that I would be the pronoun, am is the verb, a is an article, and student is a noun. So they would just, you could do however many of these you feel you needed to. Maybe this is something that you did at the very beginning of the class, just so that they started to recognize English sentence structures, however you would want to do that. But maybe you'd spend some time doing English first. Then, after you've done some English and they're starting to realize the shapes and the parts of speech that they go with, then you would start asking either the same questions or maybe some slightly varied ones in your other languages and projecting those on the board. Now, the students probably won't know what they mean because this is probably the first time that you're showing them these sentences. So you would have them, or at least I would say that the students will look up the meaning of the individual words, either individually or in small groups. So maybe at their tables, they could use a language dictionary, they could use Google Translate, they could use an online dictionary, whatever that you would let them allow them to use to look up each individual word. Once they've looked up the words in the foreign language phrase, then they would start to put their shapes in order according to that language. So I'll just scroll down here and show you an example. Maybe since I used what is your name in English, I'll just use this one really quick. Maybe I gave them this one next. I gave them Ni Jiao Shenme Mingse, which is what's your name in Chinese. So they would look up the meaning of each word. They would look up Ni, they would look up Jiao, they would look up Shenme, they would look up Mingse. And they would realize that Ni is actually you. If you look at my literal translation down here, Ni is you, therefore it's a pronoun. So they would use their triangle. Jiao is call or called, so that would be the verb. Shenme is actually what, so that would be the question word. And Mingse is the word name. So once they put their shapes in order, they realize, oh, actually, instead of what is your name, which is their tendency, they see it's actually you called what name. And the what and the you are kind of flipped around in this case. So that is something that they would realize is a difference. So then scrolling back up here, you would have them share these observations either at their table or with the whole class. Maybe they found a similarity, maybe they found a difference, just either way, having them share that with each other. And maybe they would be helping table mates who didn't quite see the difference yet. So once they've started to do that, you can either give them another phrase. Maybe you give them what is your name in a different language, or maybe you give them another Chinese phrase. It kind of depends on however you want to adapt this lesson. But they would start to just put these shapes in order in patterns, and maybe they are finding patterns in the language. So maybe once you've done this for a little while, they can then start to find variations of the phrases or whole new ones to test their comparison. So instead of using phrases that I give them, then they can start to research their own. Maybe they want to know the phrase, where's the bathroom? And they could look that up themselves. Or maybe they want to know how to say, how are you? And they could look that one up as well. So you can kind of just adapt and vary this lesson any way you want to. So some variations or notes on this lesson then, that you could do this at the beginning of each language to highlight language patterns. So maybe when I start Chinese, I start with this activity so that they start to see the patterns in Chinese sentence structure. Or maybe I do it at the beginning of the class to get exposure to all 5 languages at the same time. Or maybe I do this at the end of the course to review it. Or maybe just throughout the entire course, I could say, oh, well, look at this phrase or look at this sentence. How would that be if we got our shapes out? What would that look like? So I think that it's interesting. I could use this activity in any way. Also, you could use the same exact phrases in each language, or you could choose sentences that highlight differences. For example, if I wanted to do what is your name in all 5, I could do that, and they could see the differences or similarities between what is your name in all 5 languages. But I could also choose sentences that highlight differences. For example, if you know any Spanish or teach any Spanish, you already know that noun phrases are sort of backwards in Spanish. So I could maybe give noun phrases to highlight the fact that they're different. So you can kind of, again, adapt that as well. Then, depending on ability or differentiation, like I said, once students start to seem to grasp the activity, they could start researching their own useful phrases or about me statements. Maybe they want to describe themselves. I am this many years old. I live here. I'm from there. They could pretty much come up with anything they want themselves and start to put those into sentence structures. This activity, I think, is very interesting because not only will it help them understand the sentence structures that we're learning, but it also kind of helps them understand the difference between literal and functional meanings. That is one thing that I found has been an issue when I start to teach these languages to 7th graders, is that they think everything is going to fit into the same exact structure as it does in English. And so they think that, como te llamas in Spanish is literally what is your name, and it's not. So, that's the functional meaning, is what's your name, but it's not the literal meaning. So I think that this activity will definitely help to turn on some light bulbs in that area too. So I'm just going to show you some of my sample sentences and constructions, so things that I might project on the board to get them to start finding out. So I did one from each language. I have Genki des as my number one. So Genki des is Japanese, and it means I am well or fine as an answer to how are you, but it literally means well, fine is. So once they look up those two words individually, Genki and then des, they'll realize that Genki is the adjective, well and fine, but is the verb. And so they see, oh, that's interesting. The verb here comes second, which is not something that always happens in English. And they'll start to realize that if they plug in more phrases here, like I am bad, or I am so-so, or I am not good, that actually des always comes second. So they will start to find that pattern. My second one I kind of already went through is Ni Jiao Shima Mingsa, and that again is Chinese for what is your name. But if they look up each individual word, they find that it's actually you called what name, and they start to realize, okay, that's interesting. And this here, the question word comes here in the middle, which is question word usually comes at the beginning in English. So there's a difference there. My third and fourth example are in Spanish and French, but I used the same sentence. So you see that yo soy una chica deportista and je suis une fille athlétique. They are actually very similar when you're comparing Spanish and French, but when you're comparing Spanish and French to English, you see, okay, well, that's interesting. The adjective comes after the noun. So again, that would be the noun phrases I was talking about. Like in English, we know that it comes determiner, then adjective, then noun. But actually in these two languages, it goes determiner, noun, adjective. So that would be something, again, they could plug in other words. Maybe they want to use smart, funny, kind, or other things like that. And they can start to see that, hey, that's a pattern. The adjective always comes after the noun. And then I used my final example here was German. And again, I used what's your name to kind of highlight that difference again, because you see in German that even though it is what is your name as a functional meaning, it's literally how called you. So they can start to see that, okay, how does come at the beginning like it does in English, but you comes at the end, unlike it does in English. So again, this is all about finding patterns, and they could start to plug in other phrases and other sentences and other things and start to really get a grasp on not only their syntactic categories, but also start to memorize these words. I think that that would help quite a bit. So I find this activity very interesting. I think it would be really fun for them. It's kind of a very eye-opening, I think, activity, and I think that they would be really interested in that. But I also feel like this is for my world language class, but it could also work very well in an E&L actual classroom, because they could then start to compare and contrast using these shapes. They could compare English and their native language. I think that that would be a really great activity for E&L as well, to start to recognize patterns and start to see differences. So I think that I will actually be using this lesson next year. It's a very fun one for me to come up with and do. And I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you have any comments or questions, please reply to the thread. Thank you.